Hello, I'm Dr. Kurt Borchardt, and this is a video lecture for Soc 340, the Holocaust. And today I want to talk with you about Holocaust perpetrators and what's called the social psychological perspective on their actions. Some people, when they study the Holocaust, focus largely on those who were victimized or targeted. Others might study things like the perpetrators, the people who did the crimes. There are other categories you can talk about as well. Categories like, for example, bystanders. You can talk about collaborators, various different ways of thinking about all the different participants in relation to each other. This particular interest area, I think, is important to note because what it helps do is perhaps explain some things about human beings, some things that are held by all human beings, that can relate to why people acted the way they did. And this is a big question. Why would someone commit very heinous crimes over and over again, such as those discussed in Ordinary Men, the book by Christopher Browning? And this is a book that I'd like you to read for the course. It's very important to have the perspective of the people who enacted the crime if you're going to figure out how to stop it in the future or what were the causal reasons. Let's begin with Theodore Adorno's definition of social psychology. This was a man who emigrated from Germany, and he developed the modern field of social psychology in part by defining it in three different parts for each half of the definition. So here's the def, is the study of how human behavior, thoughts, and feelings are affected by the presence of another, whether that is real, implied, or imagined. My lines are not very straight today, forgive me. The point here is that humans have behavior, actions, thoughts, cognition, and feelings. We can roughly call it emotions. Those are affected by the presence of another person. And that presence can be real, can be someone next to you, for example. Implied, someone, say, is supposed to be in another room and they're watching you through a two-way mirror. Or imagined. You might think that someone's watching you when in fact no one is, or someone's present when no one is. And this is important because it helps us get to this question. How could perpetrators do these acts? When you look at Ordinary Men, there's no shortage of horrifying descriptions of things that the men in the police battalion 101 did to groups of people who were unarmed and defenseless, sometimes having to shoot people within 6 feet over and over again all day long, and then doing it again the next day or a few days later, and again and again. So there's this question of how can people overcome such a basic moral code of thou shalt not kill? And when you think about how the Holocaust unfolded, there was a lot of face-to-face killing. A lot of people seem to think that it happened mostly in the death camps, but there was a good number of people who were killed by what were called the Einsatzgruppen, which are mobile killing squads. And again, that's the focus of Browning's book. He does an entire study of this police battalion, and then at the very end of the book, does this amazing thing where he takes on a field that isn't his field. Browning's a historian, and he wants to actually go a step further than just documenting the history. He wants to try to show how the people who could commit these crimes were ordinary men. They were more like you and me than different. And that's a hard thing for people to feel, that they might have something in common with Holocaust perpetrators. So that concerns some of the points I'm about to make now. When you use social psychology to study the Holocaust, some people worry that a social psychological explanation is exculpatory. What does that mean? Exculpating means it allows people to say, oh, it's not my fault. It excuses someone. And in fact, what's really important to remember is that a social psychological explanation does not remove personal responsibility. Basically, it's saying that there are social psychological forces at work, but also that people made choices when they were deciding how to act during this historic period and in certain contexts. There's another issue, too, with applying social psych to the Holocaust. I'm going to talk with you about different experiments and different researchers, and there is a feeling that no experiment can really translate into what was going on during this historic period in these particular contexts. So the point here is that if you take research from social psychology and try to understand the Holocaust involved multiple variables happening at once. And often when you look at social psychological experiments, they're trying to reduce everything to one variable to look for cause, to see if that variable has a causal relationship with behavior or feelings or thoughts from other individuals. So there's a feeling that you can only take these experiments so far to understand the Holocaust. And another point, the beginning of a social psychological approach is the idea of a core human nature, something that we all share. And that can be upsetting to people to think they might have things in common with Holocaust perpetrators. So as I said in the previous slide, there are people who resist applying a social psychological perspective to understanding Holocaust perpetrator behavior. And one of their ideas is that no one wants to think of themselves as capable of committing atrocities like the people in the Einsatzgruppen in Poland did during World War II. Social psychology, though, would indicate that we share certain kinds of social processes and patterns in common. And so therefore, that can meet with emotional resistance from different people looking at this. People want to say, oh, the perpetrators were unique, they were evil, they were somehow fundamentally outside of normal human beings. And this perspective says, no, they actually have things in common with everyday people. And so this is something that you can think about when reading his book and studying this topic. I'll be going through some key studies with you in social psychology, and I want to make sure that we touch on each one a bit, so I'm going to go into a little bit of detail that hopefully will help you understand why they're important. The first one being Stanley Milgram's work from 1964, another key study by Solomon Asch from 1956, Teifel's work from the early 80s, Philip Zimbardo, his study of prisoners and guards at Stanford. He created a mock prison to see how those roles would play out. Hamilton and Kellman, and also Frederick Katz from 1993. So to begin, we'll talk a little about Milgram. There's a wonderful video you can find of his whole study. It's in black and white. It's called Obedience, and you'll be able to see how these play out with certain people in the video, how the experiment unfolded. But to begin with, Stanley Milgram was a social psychologist, and he became very, very famous for this set of experiments that he did. They were conducted at Yale, and what happened was they came after the Nuremberg Trials. The Nuremberg Trials were a set of trials that were broadcast internationally, and they were going after Holocaust perpetrators, key figures in the administration, higher ups. And many of these people who were at these trials, very, very high-ranking, significant figures in the Nazi regime, many people said, look, I was just following orders. I was doing what I was told to do. And so Milgram said, this is fascinating. Is this something unique to German people, that they're more likely to follow orders than ordinary people? Is this something that ordinary people do? So he wanted to do a study to see what's the power of somebody telling you what to do and whether or not people would follow those. Milgram wanted to see whether or not what happened in the Holocaust was the result of a specific German mentality, people just tending to follow orders, or something that was, again, across maybe different groups, a tendency among human beings. So he set up a very specific and fascinating experiment that's referred to this day, where he had 3 different people visibly involved. There was the subject, who is called the naive subject. And this is, I refer to as NS, the naive subject. This person here does not know that they are involved in an experiment. The Confederate subject, on the other hand, is this fellow, and you have it written up here as a fake test subject. That is somebody who's going to be put in an isolated space and is going to pretend to feel pain that's being delivered by this naive subject. And then the third component is the presence of an experimenter, a man in a white or gray lab coat, who urges the participant to keep going with the experiment. So as I have it down here, I say a man in a gray lab coat, running the experiment, tells the people initially, and by the way, these 2 people show up together. They've supposedly been selected from random applicants and then tested for psychological normality. And he gets them together. This guy, of course, doesn't know that this person's in on the experiment. And the experimenter says, we're here to study the effects of punishment on learning. So what happens, and this is really key, the naive subject was deceived about the true nature of the experiment going in. And that's what allowed Milgram to test to see what effects authority would have on his or her behavior. There were later studies that also used women and tried to figure out if there were patterns based on sex as well. The naive subject in the experiment is told to read the word pairs once and then test the Confederate on whether they've learned them. When the Confederate subject misses an association, the man in the white or gray lab coat tells that naive subject to deliver a shock, the initial shock being 15 volts. And then with each repeating of the list, the naive subject is supposed to raise the shock level by 15 volts. So what happens is they go through the entire list once, and then at the end of it, they go through it again, with the learner being exposed again to those questions that he missed. And then if he's getting it wrong the second time, he's getting a shock of 30 volts. Third time, 45 volts. You see the pattern here. What's really crucial about this is to note that the naive subject, the teacher, is being deceived. The Confederate is not attached to any electric current. The Confederate intentionally is missing associations according to a plan. So he's getting things wrong according to a schedule that Milgram had set up in advance. And some of this was even pre-recorded so that it would be the same set of words used by the person who's supposed to be the learner, so that the experiment would have no other variable except for the authority and whether or not people were obedient. So what happens is those pre-recorded messages are played at certain points in the learning process where the naive subject hears the voice of the learner saying, hey, let me out, I refuse to continue, my heart's bothering me. And if the naive subject tries to stop participating, if the naive subject, say for example, looks over at the experimenter and says, hey, I think I'm hurting this guy, then what happens is the experimenter also has a script that they're following. And it says things like, you must continue with the experiment, or please continue, or I am responsible, or I take full responsibility for what happens here. And again, it's all scripted. So in a way, this is a kind of a diabolical setup. And this setup, again, if you watch the video, it's amazing to watch people struggle with someone telling them what to do and something that they've agreed to do versus the fact that they may be causing pain to another person. And the results shocked everyone. There was a group of psychologists who were asked before this experiment happened what percentage of people they thought would continue doing this till the very end. And they said hardly anyone, I think it was less than 1%, thought people would go all the way. But in fact, Milgram found that in one part of the study at least, there were many, many different trials of this run, but in one study, around 65% of the teachers continued to shock into the triple X range. They went all the way to the end of the scale, and even after the Confederate learner said he would not continue and stopped answering. So that's kind of stunning when you think about that 2/3 of people would go all the way based on somebody telling them to do it. After the experiment, Milgram made a point of coming out and debriefing the naive subject and saying no one was shocked. This was all set up to test authority and obedience. And as I said a second ago, he did many variations on this experiment. Some involved just women, men, different social classes, and he did the experiment in many different places around the world, and others have reproduced this experiment and found similar results. So one could say this is a very useful study to see how perpetrators might have been influenced. Others might say, well, wait a minute, let's not take this too far. There are some issues with applying this type of study to understanding what happened during the Holocaust. And again, Milgram created this in a way to try to tease out a single variable to say, well, this is maybe causal or not. But here's some forms of resistance to applying Milgram's experiment to understanding the Holocaust. Milgram, that experiment, no one was killed. And during the Holocaust, people were really killed. So that's something that you can't reproduce, right, in an experimental lab setting. There's also a criticism you can add that Nazis hated Jews. And in Milgram, you don't really have that kind of hatred present. These are people who are just meeting each other for the first time. And so there's no history of like anti-Semitism. There's no pressure from outside to feel these people are lesser than. And also in Milgram, people didn't live and work together for weeks as they did as perpetrators in the Einsatzgruppen. The perpetrators would move from place to place and live together, be together, and you could say enforce each other's behavior or reinforce. Also, too, it's really crucial to remember that Holocaust perpetrators were at war, they were in occupied territory, and they were all in uniform. And if you think about what a uniform is, it creates this idea of we're all similar to each other. And that's part of what the military promotes. We're a force that's working together. So these are important things to consider where you can only apply these experiments so far. And what's really crucial is to know how far maybe you can, but then also, as I just did, describe some of the problems with applying a study like this. What Browning found in his book is remarkably close to Milgram's ideas, though. He found that the men in Police Battalion 101 did initially act like Milgram's subjects. Milgram's subjects were unsure, uneasy. They would often do a shock and then have to raise the shock, and then eventually maybe turn to the experimenter and say, well, he's saying he has a heart condition, or he's saying he's not going to continue. Can't we stop? Can't you look in on him and various things? And again, that experimenter was rigorous. He said, no, I'm responsible for what happens, and we have to continue. You have to continue the experiment. So initially, you could say that this is a useful experiment for thinking about what happened with some of Police Battalion 101 when they were, again, in occupied territory. They were doing these mass killings in Poland. But it's important ultimately to use caution to understand the Holocaust through some type of experiment like Milgram conducted. Now we get to a second very important experiment, Solomon Asch's work, and it's on conformity. In his setup, he did an experiment where he had 6 Confederates and 1 naive subject. So 6 people who were in on the experiment, 1 person who was being tested to see how they would act. There was one line to the left. So everybody's seeing one line on the left and three different lines on the right. And the researcher asks which line on the right is closest in length to the one on the left. And you can very easily tell looking at this. This is pretty much how it was presented to them, that it's pretty much easy. You can see that C really is the closest line in length to the comparison point. And so this wasn't trying to trick people through visual distortion or anything like this. It was to check and see whether or not the naive subject would go against other people's responses if those people seem to be systematically wrong. So he would go through and ask one at a time, each person, which line best matches. And people, the Confederates would, in a row, would go, well, C matches. And then the next one would go C. And the next person, C, C. They'd eventually get to the naive subject who would then go along and say, well, C, because his eyes matched up with what other people were saying. But then Ash did this clever thing where he had the people answer systematically wrong, his Confederate subjects. So they would say, well, in the next version of this, the next version, there were different lengths of lines and different comparison lines. And so maybe in the next version, every one of them would say, oh, it's A. A is the closest in length. The next person, A. The next person, A. And the next person, A. And then what you can see if you look online for these, it's rather fun to watch, because the naive subject sometimes ends up looking at these people and saying, really, that's kind of how you're seeing this, and sort of presenting a little disbelief that they're not seeing what he or she is seeing. And what was fascinating was the extent to which people would change their answer, even though it was clear which line was the best match. 37% of the naive subjects responded incorrectly when the Confederates consistently answered incorrectly. So this was a very useful study because it indicates the pressure of groups on opinions. If you hear people's opinions delivered one at a time, and then you're the one who has to give theirs, you might well be influenced. And it raises these questions about conformity, because one interesting part of this is this situation was totally not coercive. Nobody was saying, you have to do this, you must do this, you must shoot these people. This was a situation where people went along just of their own accord to line up better with what the group was doing. So this is an important addition to Milgram in understanding the perpetrator behavior which occurred in the Holocaust. As the Holocaust absolutely is inseparable from group behavior. Then we get to a researcher, Teifel, and his interest. What's the basis on which group identity begins to form? And what he looks at was that a sense of group identity would create a greater tendency to conform than found with Ash. Remember that with Ash, these were seen as individuals. They weren't seen as people who knew each other or worked together. So it was a group, but it was a group of people who were separate individuals. Teifel wanted to see what would happen if you have a sense of group identity, and would that create a greater tendency to conform than Ash found. And I should have mentioned previously, Henry Teifel was born in Poland in 1919, so he lived through the war, and he was actually also rounded up and confronted by Nazis, somehow managed to survive the war, and spent the rest of his academic life thinking about these questions about group conformity, why people may act differently when they're in the presence of other people and certain factors are there. So extending and refining some of Ash's work, Teifel says that group identity is going to have a multiplying effect on the conformity that people experience when they're with other people doing some activity. So in the Ash experiment, again, as I mentioned, each individual person was asked what their opinion of the line length was. What Teifel wants to say is that what happens if it's not just individuals who are doing this who don't know each other, who have just been chosen for this experiment supposedly at random? What if it's people who do know each other, who have been interactive with each other, maybe even for a longer period of time, and have some sense of group identity? And again, as I said, this multiplies the conformity effect. And in particular, you can think about whoever is stuck together in wartime. What might be the effects of that? In wartime, your group identity as a soldier in a unit becomes even stronger because the enemy and unknown others are all around you. These factors help understand why people as a group would do things they would never have done as individuals. And that's a really important point for understanding the social psychological aspects of perpetrator behavior. What would happen when the men in Battalion 101 wanted to get out of killing? You could say, well, what would they say? And there's a very interesting initial story, the very first one, called One Morning in Josepho in Ordinary Men. And it describes an incident, July 13th, 1942. A group of Einsatzgruppen, middle-aged family men of Polish and lower middle-class background from Hamburg, considered to be of no use to the German army because they were too old. They were headed for a major action. They hadn't been told what to expect. They went into the dark, headed eastward, and finally came upon Josepho, a mere 30 kilometers away. This was a typical Polish village. Among its inhabitants were 1,800 Jews. The village was totally quiet. The men of the Reserve Police Battalion climbed down from their trucks, assembled in a half circle around their commander, Major Wilhelm Trapp, a 53-year-old career policeman, affectionately known as Papa Trapp. Pale and nervous, with choking voice and tears, Trapp fought to control himself as he spoke. The battalion, he said plaintively, had to perform a frightfully unpleasant task. The assignment was not to his liking, but it came from the highest authorities, and if it would make anything easier for the men, they should remember that in Germany, bombs were falling on innocent women and children. He then turned to the matter that basically there were Jews in the village who were involved with partisans, which were groups of people, bands of armed soldiers who worked against the Nazis. And those groups, partisans, he said, were now were completely anti-Nazi, and basically they're the opposite side trying to kill. And so what he ordered was that the remaining Jews were to be separated. Men had to go to work, taken to a work camp, but the remaining women, children, elderly people were to be shot on the spot by the men in that group. But after explaining this, he made a remarkable offer to the men. He said, if any of the older men among them did not feel up to the task that lay before him, he could step out. In other words, he gave them an option whether or not to participate in this mass execution of unarmed women and children. And what would happen in situations where the men were told to do these things is there would be some who would comply. There would be others who would try to do things like, for example, shoot in the air or shoot to the side to try to do what they were doing in spirit, maybe you could say, but not actually kill. But the major way in which people would get out of the killing would be to say, I'm too weak. I'm too weak. I can't do this myself. And that's a very important statement, because when people say, I'm too weak, they're not contradicting the values of the group. They're not saying, I can't do this because what you're doing is murder. They can't say, I'm not going to do this because this violates moral code, thou shalt not kill. So they're not directly telling the people that what they're doing is bad or wrong. They're just saying, hey, I can't do it. And that was seen as a sufficient way of getting out of that type of really horrific activity. And it's brought up by Browning in the book that the records show that no one, no Nazi, no member of the Einsatzgruppen was ever killed for not being able to engage in one of these types of mass killings. Instead, what they were given were other tasks. Well, they're guarding the perimeter, or they need to do the head counts of people, other things that were necessary for this to occur, but without the direct action. So that's something that you can say reaffirms group norms differently than saying, oh, killing is wrong. That would be confrontational to the group and would say, I don't agree with you and this is terrible. So what happens is this, according to Browning, reaffirms Nazi ideology because that emphasizes valuing strength, that you have to be strong, you have to be above certain things in order for the Nazi conquest to occur. And again, those who were considered too weak could still do something else. They can contribute, but they didn't have to do that specifically onerous task. Next, we can talk about the Zimbardo prison experiment, another very important experiment in social psychology, one of the top 5 easily top 5 experiments. And the way it was set up, Philip Zimbardo was a psychologist, and he called for 24 male student volunteers, tested them for psychological stability, and then set up a mock prison in the Stanford basement in which to conduct his experiment. And I should mention that this basement was really set up to look like a prison, and the guards and the prisoners had drawn straws to figure out what their roles were, and they were told a little bit of what was going on, but in order to make it seem more real, the prisoners were picked up from their houses in police cars and put in cuffs and all of this, and it created a sense right from the beginning where people seemingly forgot where reality ends and the experiment begins, and that they could quit from the experiment at any time. So as I have here, they drew straws. You have 12 prisoners, 12 guards, so random selection. The guards were assigned certain kinds of props like handcuffs and glasses to make this work. The prisoners wore aprons and stockings on their head, so they also had numbers. They were defined very differently in terms of appearance and the roles that they had. And Zimbardo had 2 very clear rules that he wanted everyone to follow. But he told the guards, number 1, order must be maintained. He made it vague, but clear. The second rule was no physical violence. So it created, you could say, in the guard's mind, an idea of, well, how can I act given these kinds of parameters? Here's my role, and my status is as a guard, but how do I enact that role given these basic rules? And what you find, and what Zimbardo found, was that some of the people enacted the roles very, very differently from others, which I'll talk about. There were groups of guards who grew sadistic, verbally abusive, and withheld food. So they took the rule and they pushed it as far as they could in terms of nasty behavior toward these prisoners. The prisoners in turn then also took on those characteristics. Some of them became very apathetic, withdrawn, and became sort of prisoner-esque, if you will. So the power of the role in putting people into doing actions that they didn't even necessarily think themselves capable of was revealed through this experiment. Zimbardo himself even became sort of mesmerized by this experiment. When he himself tried to stop an escape, a prisoner who was trying to escape, he was told, I can't believe what you're doing to these boys, by his then graduate student, Christine Malczak. And once he heard that, I can't believe what you're doing to these boys, that made him remember that this is an experiment and these are real people, and that if someone wants to quit, they should be allowed to quit. The findings of this, again, like very, very well-known experiment, showed very clearly the power of role adaptation on behavior. You may take on roles in your life, and you may find yourself doing things that you never thought you'd do. Some people become parents and then they say, I can't believe I'm just reenacting what my mother said when I was a kid. So the role itself can cause behavior and can channel actions in ways that a person might never think themselves possible of doing. It also showed the power trip that a role can put some people on. Some people revel and exploited the role, took it as far as they could. And finally, it showed people can become gratuitously cruel without any personal hatred of the victim, really even without even personal knowledge of the victim. These people were anonymous to each other before being put into context where things devolved so dramatically within 5 days. Now here's where things get interesting. Zimbardo looked at the types of guard behavior, and he ended up classifying them into 3 different types. He said there were 2 who could be called good guards. They involved in acts of kindness and mitigation with the prisoners. So they would bring prisoners extra food. They would try to not treat them badly. They were embracing the role fairly minimally, you could say. There were 7 people who were middle guards, and they were what Zimbardo thought of as following the book. They took on the role, they did what they had to do according to the role's guidelines, and they didn't do more or less. They just did what they thought the role involved. And then Zimbardo found a small group of 3 eager participants, and they became positively creative with their cruelty. So they took the role as far as they could in terms of whatever aberrant behavior they felt was possible within that role. This is going to be important for the last slide that we'll talk about. A few more studies, though. Frederick Katz did a study and wrote a book, Ordinary People, Extraordinary Evil, where he looked at how gratuitous torture can come out of a dynamic of an individual within a group at a workplace. And so they found that, for example, people can be sort of systematically made into outsider status, the butt of jokes, and can be systematically bullied and teased, and that a culture of cruelty can develop around this one particular scapegoat, this person who's targeted. So that was an important addition as well to some of the other studies I've mentioned. The final study that brings some of this together in a sense, Hamilton and Kelman, and they wrote a book on Vietnam called Crimes of Obedience. So there was a particular massacre called My Lai, at My Lai, where these soldiers came and killed innocent men, women, and children. They thought that they had been involved in acts against them and combat, and they were merciless, and many innocent civilians, unarmed civilians, were killed. The authors looked at the different ways in which people comply or obey, and they themselves also created 3 categories. There were those people in the groups of soldiers who complied with orders because they identified with the purpose or the higher meaning of those orders, and they called them the true believers. So there are people whose behavior lines up quite well with their thinking, and that means that they are in agreement that, for example, if you're a Nazi and you believe in anti-Semitism and you believe in that party and your behavior lines up with that, that would be considered somebody who's a true believer. He said, said though that there were others who complied and sometimes acted in awful ways through role adaptation. So their justification for their action was, as a soldier, I must shoot these people. It's in my role. They don't have some higher ideal in mind while they're doing this. They're basically just reproducing what's asked of them in relation to that role. So during actions in a war that result in atrocities, like My Lai, you have these 3 different groups. You have the true believers, and their ideology matches up with what they did. The other group acted through role adaptation. They did what they thought the role needed to do, and they didn't have any necessary strong ideological orientation toward what they were doing. So they might feel a little bit strange doing, these types of mass killings. And then the third group that Hamilton and Kelman found was people in those soldier groups who engaged in nominal compliance. They basically did as little as they felt they could get away with. They complied only when authority was present while supervised. Otherwise, they shot into the air or they tried to do other things. They were not going along with the ideology. So here's where things come together in terms of Browning's book and these other studies I've talked about. The people who were engaged in role adaptation, number 2 from the previous slide, and nominal compliance above, were people that those researchers said would suffer from cognitive dissonance. Now, that means people want to have consistency between the things like what they believe and their opinions and their actions. So a great example of this is like a smoker. A smoker knows full well that their behavior is not good, right? So they're at odds with themselves. And what smokers have to do if they're going to continue with this addiction is they come up with rationalizations for why they're doing this. So smokers might say things like, well, I'll quit before I get cancer, or my dad smoked to be 100 and nothing happened to him, or I smoke light cigarettes, these types of things. And that's so that they won't feel cognitive dissonance. Excuse me. So inconsistencies between attitudes and behaviors can create that jarring feeling in people that they want to resolve. I often think of like a little kid banging notes on a piano. It's dissonant because the notes don't go together, and it makes everyone around them tense. They just want the kid to stop. So cognitive dissonance is the idea that this is uncomfortable, this difference between beliefs and behavior, and the person wants to resolve it. And so this is where it all comes together, you could say. In cases of a discrepancy between an attitude someone has and a behavior that they're engaging in, there's a greater likelihood that the attitude is going to change to accommodate the behavior. In other words, these people who were indoctrinated into this terrible killing that happened in Vietnam and in Poland during World War II, they changed their minds when they couldn't change their behavior. They weren't really allowed to change their behavior. They were faced with this situation over and over again. So eventually it caused them so much psychological stress that they developed into true believers. And that is a fascinating thing that Browning came up with. There was another researcher at the time who was looking at the same data set as Browning was, and his name was Goldhagen. And Goldhagen wrote a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners. And the idea he pursued was that Germany had this history of anti-Semitism, and it would result in killing, that the ideology and the actions lined up well with each other. Browning said, no, it's actually a two-way street, that you have ideology, but not everybody's complying with it. And that means that people have to be held accountable for their individual actions, but you really can't take the group dynamics out of how they made their decisions. So people should be held accountable for their actions, again, but social psychology and its insights are very useful to understand perpetrator behavior. These explanations are not exculpatory. They don't excuse the behavior, but they really do help explain it. And so the bottom line then for us, the nominal killers, the above part of the slide here, through repeated actions became true believers. Thank you.